Welcome back. Welcome back. We're at Unit 8, Culture and Communication. So, great topic, great section. I love this section because it's something we don't always think about in communication. Culture, we'll start there. It's a complicated word to define. There's many ways it's used within the United States, but in this vernacular, culture is defined as the ongoing negotiation of learned and patterned beliefs, attitudes, values, and behaviors. Let me move this arm a bit because it seems I'm having a little problem with the mic today. It's been a week, been a month, honestly. Anyway, when we unpack this definition, we can see that culture shouldn't be conceptualized as a kind of stable or unchanging thing. Culture is a negotiated, meaning we learn about culture, we learn how to adapt and work within various cultures, how our behavior affects others within cultures, and therefore affects our communication. We're going to cover a great deal. The definition also points out that culture is learned. Remember, I just said that. Ultimately, it's patterned, but we don't want to be stereotypical, and we're going to talk more about that as well. When we talk about personal, social, and cultural identities, we don't always think about all of our identities that we possess. Boy, I misspelled identities too, didn't I? Anyway, cultural identities help form our personal identities. For instance, we as Americans, we as a Western culture, think a certain way, behave certain ways. When we think back to that self-concept, we talked about that. We talked about how our parents and friends, teachers, media help shape our identities. This begins to happen shortly after birth. As we're learning and adapting our behaviors, we're learning what our culture means to us. But in our adolescence, it really kind of takes off. It's where we're maturing as individuals, where we're starting to really define who we are, and we have a greater social awareness of who we are, and how we place within our groups of friends or in society, and who we might become. We learn those things. We start to really adapt those in our adolescence. Our identities are part of our self-concept, right? And they can be broken down into three categories: personal, social, and cultural identities. And I talked a bit about identity before in another unit, but I'll talk more about it here because, again, culture and how we adapt to cultures and how we communicate within cultures is what we're talking about here. So, I included table 8.1, but look at it. You can see the things that this individual was, and it was one of the ones, it talks about all the different things you could be and more. There's tons more. Our identity is not something that's constant. Instead, our identities are formed through processes that started before we were actually born because of, again, culture, our society, our Western Hemisphere culture, and will continue long after we are gone. Therefore, identities aren't something we achieve or complete. They evolve over time. Two related but distinct components of our identities are our personal and our social identities. Personal identities include components of self that are primarily intrapersonal and connected to our life experiences, whereas social identities are components of self that are derived from involvement in social groups, which we are interpersonally committed. We derive aspects of our social identity from our family or from the fact that we might be fans of a sports team. Our social identities differ from our personal identity because they're externally organized through some sort of membership. Our membership may be voluntary. We could join like an organization or a church, right? It could be involuntary. We're stuck with our family. Sorry. And explicit. We pay dues. For instance, if you're part of a labor union, it could be implicit. We purchase and listen to certain types of music, right? There are numerous options for personal and social identities. While our personal identity expresses our choices in that area, express who we are, our social identities align us with particular groups. So through our social identities, we make statements about who we are and who we are not. So I listed a few of mine here. I am from the Midwest. I'm from St. Louis, Missouri, and that is the flag for the city of St. Louis, the convergence of two rivers, Mississippi and the Missouri, right there at St. Louis. Notice the fleur de lis. It's French influence, right? It was heavily settled by the French early on, well before it ever became part of the United States. Kind of like New Orleans story. In fact, honestly, both were settled by the same group of people, the Acadians, and some of my ancestry are Acadian. They are French. They came through Canada. But I also have Irish American, and pictures of me that I may have shown in this class, which I believe I have and will show in this class. You'll see me with red hair because that was my predominant color of hair. I was brownish red haired most of my life. That's only recently that the silver and white has started to take over. It started simply enough by claiming the blonde hairs I had, and then eventually my red highlights went. And now I'm pretty much varying shades of gray, much like a dog I own. It's part of who I am, right? These are all things. I'm also a teacher, a professor, right? I'm also 1/4 Cherokee. Notice the Cherokee flag. I'm married. The rings signify that, right? I included membership of a band that I enjoy their music, 9 Inch Nails. I also love the St. Louis Cardinals. Again, purchase tickets, go to see them. Did not see them last year. We'll go to see them this year, even though they'll be worse than they were last year, because at least we're committed to a plan. Last year we weren't committed to much of anything. And then I included one last clue about myself. From the region I'm from, this was a band, and this band went on to be one of the movers and shakers in the alternative country movement. You wouldn't have modern country music without people like Uncle Tupelo. So there's also a magazine called No Depression. It's actually more of a website now because no one really gets magazines anymore. But it talks, No Depression talks specifically about alternative country music, or, not mainstream, but it was. And here we get to see some pictures of me as well. Personal identities change, right? People have new experiences, develop new interests and hobbies, and we age. A current interest in online games today may give way to an interest in graphic design tomorrow. Social identities don't change as often because they take more time to develop, because you're intrapersonally invested in those. So here we have me again, and then we have me on the mic at Sun Records, right? I thoroughly enjoyed that day, and yes, I was ecstatic. Those are my dogs, which one of them is coming down the stairs right behind me to join us in our class. That is Lucy, Lucrezia, and Lola. Lucrezia is the gray one. She's 15 different colors of gray. And Lola is a multi-poo. She's white and a little bit of that apricot color. So I'm a dog owner, and I've loved dogs for years. These are the smallest dogs I've ever owned. Most of my dogs were sled dogs. I've owned pit bulls. They get a bad rap. But, mine were great because they were trained to be good dogs. So here we have, moving on the bottom row left to right, we have Uncle Tupelo. I'm hanging out with the band itself. Picture next to it was a couple years later as I was headed to a Nine Inch Nails show with one of my friends. You can see the photograph of me, and she managed to get her leg in there, of course. But that was me in my place, my apartment, way back when. So there I am with my wife in the last two, and you can see that, again, membership in the social group of the St. Louis Cardinals fandom. So there I am, and of course there I am again with my wife. So, we express ourselves differently. We change, we grow, we adapt. And our cultural identities do too. They're based socially on constructs, and they teach us a way of being, including expectations for social behavior or how we should act, right? We are part of them since birth. People who are multicultural get an added bonus because they get to be immersed in cultural worlds of perhaps Western and Eastern cultures. Yes, Lola, come here, since you were insistent on being part of the show. I don't know if you can see little Lola. There is little Lola. So, all right, can you rest? You guys were doing a splendid job of resting. As people in multiple, that are exposed to multiple cultures do over time, they get to move between cultural worlds and cultural expectations that are very different many times. And we're going to talk more about that. We also create codes. By code, what I mean is learning in a way of behavior that group members will accept us in, right? So we may tell a parent or friend what it means to be a man or a woman, right? We may unconsciously consume messages from popular culture through social media that offer representations of gender, right? And again, I'm 1/4 Native American, so most of my life I've checked multiple races box on my applications to school and jobs, and while I may not look super Native American, get me out in the sun, and you'll see, because my Irish roots, certainly, that pale skin, I don't have. I have the ability to tan quite well. So culture has done a lot of different things, and it will do a lot of different things. Some of those things are great, some of those things are not quite so great, and unfortunately we're ascribed that because we're part of it. We're American, right? Oh no, you go to another country like France, and Americans aren't really loved there. I'm going to try to find the nicest way to say that. In my time in France, when I worked for an ad agency, while I was finishing my bachelor's and actually working on my master's at the same time, I was blessed to have that opportunity. I enjoyed it thoroughly. It was only for about a little over a month. But I learned a lot about the differences in advertising through other cultures. And one might say, well, it's France, it couldn't be that different. It's quite different. They have 8 minutes to 12 minutes total advertising time in an hour. Think about all the TV ads we're bombarded by, even if we're streaming many times, we're still bombarded by ads, right? Unless we're paying for ad-free. When we talk about identity types, they can be ascribed or avowed. Ascribed identities are personal, social, or cultural identities that are placed on us by others. While avowed are those we claim for ourselves. Most people wouldn't notice that I'm Native American, part Native American. But I know I am. My bloodline says I am. My DNA says that I am. And so maybe it's more avowed than other people would ascribe to me, correct? So you think about, if you like to read, science fiction books or watch documentaries, if you have glasses, collect Star Trek memorabilia, someone might call you a nerd. Now that person may or may not avow that identity, and that would create friction. That label would hurt the other person's feelings. But sometimes ascribed and avowed identities can match up. For instance, in school, I was pretty smart, but I also played sports. So it was a weird combination. I wasn't quite 100% accepted by the jocks. I certainly was not a nerd. So it was a weird space for me. I honestly didn't enjoy my high school that much. It was okay. It was to prepare me to go play baseball and then eventually go to college and move on with my life. But one thing I did learn from high school, I was blessed by living next to one of the largest air bases in the Midwest. It is Strategic Airlift Command and, let's see, SAC, and I don't know, there's another another section of the Air Force that's there, which allowed me to grow up around people from multiple cultures. People from Europe, European cultures, people from, as the Soviet bloc broke apart, people from those countries, South American countries, Asian countries, all were part of that military base because they were with other militaries that we were allied with, and they were learning to train alongside our troops, learning to handle logistics like our troops do. They were learning to be something, and so therefore they brought their cultural identity to us, and we got to experience lots of food, lots of amazing cultures, the Chinese New Year, things of that nature. It was wonderful, wonderful. That was an aspect of growing up where I grew up that I totally loved. And Yep writes about his multicultural experience, his intercultural experience. He's Asian, Latino American, and he is Chinese, nearly 50% Chinese, but then spent time living in Peru and with a Peruvian United States parent. So then came to the United States to study in school, became a communication kind of a guy that really looked at cultural communication, which is why I bring him in here. He's a perfect example of someone who's been across broad sections of culture, and he can speak clearly and cleanly about this so that we can all understand. Even our national identity fluctuates over time. Right now we're in a period of that fluctuation. And while my identity as a U.S. citizen, has always been salient to me, but it was most salient when I studied abroad in France, which I talked about earlier. So again, while you may not have experience with a lot of other cultures, take the opportunity to learn about others, because we're going to find when we talk about communication, that's what creates identity. That's what also creates clear communication. Learning, understanding, or trying to understand people from other cultures, right? Making that attempt. You have to make that attempt. So let's switch it back to identity development. So when we think about identity development, there's a couple different types. There's non-dominant identity development, and that is how most of us are perceived through our lives. The first stage is an unexamined identity, where I didn't realize I was Native American until I was part Native American until I was 10 years old. I was out in the sun and really tan, like tanner than most other of the peers I played with, and that's when my mom shared with me, yes, on your grandmother's side, on my side, you are Native American and Cherokee, to be specific. All right, you want down, Lola? Okay, hold on. I'll help you down. Okay. Then I moved to stage 2, the second stage, which was conformity, which is I wanted to learn more about it. I learned about some of their values and their beliefs, and so I started to conform as multicultural, meaning, having that Irish American heritage, having French heritage, but also having Native American heritage. The third stage was resistance, because we may or may not, and I'll talk more about this, but we may or may not exhibit some of these stages, especially 3 and 4. Some people never get to past a conformity stage. They just don't ever certainly get to the integration stage, which we'll talk about. But third stage is resistance. That's where me as a person could say, wait, no, I'm not really Native American, right? I don't really have these values and beliefs don't all match up with mine. So then I could go into separation stage and not be willing to be around Native American cultures or experience those things. Or I could go embrace, in stage 5, the integration stage, and find a balance of my own identity within all those cultural groups that I mentioned earlier, right? And that's what I chose to do. Some people don't. Some people choose to do things differently. Now, we also have dominant identity development, and the first stage of that is unexamined identity. So that is similar, all right? I didn't know, I didn't think about something. Second stage is acceptance stage, right? We accept or adapt to some of those new values and norms. The third stage, again, resistance stage. You can see there's similarities here. Number 4, though, is where we start to have a different process. And this is more of what I went through. A redefinition stage is a revision of the negative views from the third stage, the resistance stage, of my identity. I thought about things, and I found certain fits, and there's certain differences, and I was okay with that, and again, went into my integration phase, where I balanced my identity as part of these other groups. So again, remember, stage 3 may never be exhibited, and some people may never reach the integration stage. So they choose not to travel that far in their own brain, in their own sense of being and self, right? Difference matters. In communication, difference matters as well. When we encounter someone, we notice differences and similarities, right? It's natural. We don't mean to. It just happens. Often we notice differences, and those things sometimes are the point or problem when we start to look at something, we concentrate on those. We also place people into groups, in groups and out groups, meaning, do I want to hang out with them? Do I not want to? And it's based many times on the similarities and differences with them that we perceive. And this is important because we tend to react to someone we perceive as member of an out-group on the characteristics rather than as the unique individual. Okay. In those situations, it's most likely that stereotypes and prejudice will influence our communication. I'm addressing it. I'm jumping on it right here. These things can happen. If we don't learn that we're all human beings and we're all pretty similar in many ways. We're not the same, though, and we can bring so much to the table for each one of us in our uniqueness and in our cultural identities. We'll learn so much more if we're willing to embrace that. Now, some people claim that there's no differences and they see everyone as a human being. Very rarely do people actually truly do that or mean that, because you can watch their nonverbals and watch their communication and see through them completely. Point is, we should strive to communicate well. We shouldn't communicate the same to all people. We need to adapt our communication, and we're going to talk about that. Culture and identity are complex. Like I explained, my semi-struggle of blending all these different cultures together within my DNA, and how much do they influence me? And in the end, they really don't influence me a great deal. Yes, I tan a little bit better because of the Native American DNA. Irish American heritage, well, some may tell me I drink too much. I don't, but someone who's a teetotaler probably would, right? The point is, we don't have to choose to be like what are perceived or stereotypical patterns within culture, right? It's up to us to choose and unpack our various identities and reassemble them into an identity of self moving forward. When we think about identity in hierarchy of, like, in domination even, because let's be real, it's been applied throughout humanity and through human history, it does still play a part, unfortunately, but we need to step aside and look. Lola, sit. We need to step aside and be above that. We need to understand it, because that affects how we communicate as a culture. This most recent Super Bowl is a prototypical case study in an us versus them. Certain groups have decided that it's an us versus them. And when I say certain groups, I'm not picking on any one group in particular, but I am going to say, when you perceive that you need to do something different than all the masses are doing, and by the way, I chose to watch the Puppy Bowl, so that's neither here nor there. But that said, I watched all three of the events, the halftime events, just not at real time. Be careful when choosing identity and choosing culture that you're not being inclusive. Okay? I noticed one striking thing about the Turning Point event, and you could look at the audience and look at the performers, and there's a certain ethnicity about them. There was no inclusion in that event. It was simply, we picked who we wanted, who represent us. That's what they were selling in that message. Whether or not they realize it or not, that's what they sold. Okay? The Super Bowl, it had more of a message of inclusion, and the Puppy Bowl, just cute puppies, man. Who can go wrong with cute puppies? Come on. All right, difference does matter, though. And people have been treated unequally throughout history. I'll talk more about some of the struggles of identity and people that I know, and in our class a little later. So, indifference matters because of demographics and patterns of interaction that constantly change over time. So if we think about the United States, the population of people of color is increasing and diversifying. And the visibility for people who are gay and lesbian and people with disabilities have also increased. In the 2020 census, it shows that the Hispanic and Latino populations in the United States are now the second largest group in the country, having grown 43% since the last census. Well, last two censuses. Sorry. That's what it should have said. By 2030, racial and ethnic minorities will account for 1/3 of the total population in the United States. This means we have to consider how we communicate with each other, and those changing demographics will affect the future of communication, whether we want it to or not. Every year, companies spend millions on diversity training, but unless we're receptive to learning about other cultures, their values, and be willing to change our communication patterns, styles, and this training will be useless, worthless, right? It's up to us to be effective cultural communicators. We're going to talk more about how to do that. When we think about exploring specific cultural identities, there's a lot of unpacking that has to be done. We can look at histories and see that some have existed seemingly forever, right? And others have been a more recent construct. They probably have existed, but the reality is no one talked much about them. In the end, communication plays the central role in the communication of constructs of cultural identity. As we discussed earlier, Our identities are relational and communicative. They're also constructed, right? Social constructionism is a view that argues the self is formed through our interaction with others and our relationship to social, cultural, and political context. I believe in this because I've watched it. I've lived long enough to watch it in motion. We're going to talk more about race, gender, sexual orientation, and even ability, and how they've been constructed within the United States and how communication relates to each of those identities. There are other important identities that could be discussed as well, like religion, age, nationality, and class. We're going to touch on some of that, but the reality is I'm going to jump on ones that are like the touch point ones. So let's just jump on it right off the bat. Race. Because if we don't adapt communication, or if we're too narrow-minded, we alienate others. Now, I want you to think about this. My DNA, along with my friend's DNA who's from French Guiana, are 99% the same. 99.9% the same. So sometimes we focus on things that are different, and we create the social construct of race, right? It's not really much of a biological one, it's more of a social construct. And history has shown us that. Race didn't even become socially and culturally recognized marker until European colonial expansion in the 1500s to this hemisphere. As Western Europeans traveled to other parts of the world, previously unknown to them, and encountered people that were quite different from them, the hierarchy of races began to develop, and that concept of where Europeans believed themselves to be above others, right? We know what happened. Pre-Columbian, post-Columbus, right? When we think about study of sciences for like botany and other fields, though, we don't drastically question a marigold from its cousins, right? That's a flower, by the way, if those who don't know. It's a flower. But now, with 300 years of this kind of thought process regarding race kind of in play, we're confronted with this whole idea of flawed, biased, even racist, legitimized or illegitimized notions, such as Native people were savages, right? They weren't. They just lived a different way. And I included the chart from the book where it talks about race and how over time racial classifications within the United States Census occurred. Given that race is one of the first things we seem to notice about people, or at least some do, it's important to know how race and communication relate. Discussing race in the United States is difficult for many reasons. One of those is the uncertainty about what language to use. People may be frustrated that their perception of labels change too often, or being afraid to use an improper term, and then being viewed as racially insensitive. People get defensive. So it's one of those things, let's not let political correctness get in the way of meaningful dialogue, but let's also be respectful to each other, right? It's this concept of finding that path through communication. The five primary racial groups that I noticed in that chart can be broken down further for region, country, or even nations. Asian Americans are diverse. A Korean is definitely not a Japanese person. A Chinese person is definitely not a Korean. A Vietnamese is a completely different construct and people. They all have their histories. They all have their ways of doing things. When we lump people together, just like we could lump Europeans together, because the French are quite different than the British, that are quite different than the Germans. And if you don't believe me, travel to those countries and you can see the differences. You know, you hate to use classifications. I hate the phrase Asian American. It's not correct. What about Korean American or Chinese American or Japanese American, right? Or just a Korean, a Chinese person, a Japanese person. You know, stop lumping things together and start treating them as the unique things that they are. If we do that, we'll have better communication. So, when we think about Latin American, another label. Oh, labels. We love to use labels for some reason in this country. I have no idea why. Yes, Spain influenced what was South and Central America, but those people had an indigenous heritage that exists way, 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 way before the colonization, right? You know, I think about my friends who are Puerto Rican, and many of them served in the military, and yet some of them could not even vote in presidential elections. Let that one sink in for a moment. You die for a country because Puerto Rico is part of the United States as a territory, but you couldn't vote. Now, since then, military service has been included as part of the things that can create the ability to vote. We're starting to learn to change our behavior patterns and be more inclusive, even in our government. The United States has been known as the melting pot, right? But it doesn't really capture the experiences of immigrant groups. If I could show you a picture of the city of St. Louis, it was a perfect example. It was originally settled by French people, and down by the rivers where most of them lived. Then other groups joined in. There's a Polish American section. There was a German American section. You know, there was an Irish American section. There was an Italian American section. As countries experienced hardship, or as people decided, hey, I want to try to have a better way of life for my family, they moved to the United States. And those who settled in the Midwest settled into neighborhoods that were kind of gentric, right? They were kind of specific. The Hill still exists in St. Louis, by the way, and if you ever are in St. Louis and want the best Italian food, I suggest you go down there. If you want the best experience, go to Milo's, and if you want the best Italian food, go to Charlie Gito's, but you'll need a reservation to go to Gito's, and you'll need at least a jacket, okay? Because they do things kind of at Gito's in an old world kind of manner. But you won't believe, it's an amazing experience. These people do speak English. They also speak Italian, folks. Imagine that. They're very much American. But many of them are second generation. Not many of the first generation are still left because time has happened and those people immigrated so long ago. Something that some of you may not know is Irish immigrants were discriminated against and even portrayed as black in cartoons. They were portrayed as people of color or lesser humans, lesser Europeans even. And that was done in the newspapers in the 1800s. In southern states, Italian immigrants were forced to go to African American schools. That didn't change until 1950s. And then Asian Americans weren't even allowed to become part of the United States until after World War II. And if you ever want to understand more about that, look at the ones that settled on the West Coast, the Asian Americans, immigrants that were here, many who came to build a railroad, including some of my Irish American relatives. But those Asian American relatives, their land was taken from them during World War II, and they were put into camps. Eventually, they received reparations from our government, but it was way too little too late. So if you ever want to check that section of U.S. history out, there's another time where we've not been exactly stellar. The farm next to my family's farm is owned by German Americans, and they were here. They came over right after World War I. And when World War II broke out, they were not allowed to join the military, even though they were born in the United States. The boys, that would be my grandfather's age, were not allowed to join the United States military until, goodness gracious, 2 years into the war. Because we were so paranoid that the Germans would infiltrate our infantry and army and ruin it. I mean, we've had some weird thought processes. People that were born in America are American, and we need to hold to that. Because otherwise it leads to racism, right? And racism influences our communication. Because of the past history, because of things that were done, discrimination, derogatory name calling, things like that, it's made that topic difficult. But if we go back to a premise of treating others like we want to be treated ourselves and communicating to them as such, boy, that goes a long way. We can get past a lot of things. Don't assume stereotypes are correct. In fact, quite honestly, I encourage you to immerse yourself within other cultures to see how people really are, truly are. Okay? And, let's not label people. Let's let people be people. And people are unique. Right now we're dealing with some national controversy about inclusion of Spanish as a common language, right? Spanish option on ATMs, automated services, Spanish language in education in schools, right? But this is part of who America is becoming, and while that segment is growing fast, it necessitates the inclusion of Spanish in many areas of public life. For instance, if you don't like a culture and you want to live in hate, then I strongly recommend you don't get to eat their food. Okay? Because most people, once you step up and create that wall, say, hey, no, if you're not going to respect us, then why try to eat our food? Hate is a horrible thing. Isolation is a worse thing. And those two seem to run hand in hand, by the way, if we allow it to. There's fear that we've allowed English not to be our primary language, but it still is our primary language. And we can communicate in Spanish if we choose. I'm starting to relearn Spanish. I didn't do well in Spanish. My pronunciations are poor. But I'm looking and learning Spanish because I'm realizing that the world around me is changing, and I need to be able to effectively communicate with a larger audience of people than just what English can bring me. Our U.S. Constitution does not stipulate a national language for all those that want to get aggravated. I'm sorry. Congress has not even designated one either. In the 1800s, the language of choice in St. Louis, Missouri, which was part of our country in the early 1800s through the Louisiana Purchase, was French. This happens. Things change. we've had lots of immigration into this country because most of our families are not originally from here. If you trace back far enough, my wife can trace all the way back on one side of her family to the Mayflower. I've traced back on my family to Acadia. I had my French side came from Canada down the Mississippi River, saw the land around St. Louis and realized this is good farming land and settled into it. They stayed. They didn't go further south. Some went further south and settled a place called New Orleans. This is part of our culture, part of our heritage, part of who the United States are. So please don't try to exclude. Be inclusive. Try to understand we are American. All right, we're going to talk about gender and sexuality next. You notice I start off with gender right off the bat instead of sex, because gender is an identity based on cultural notions of masculinity and femininity. And it's been constructed through communication and interaction. So there's two parts of that definition I need to unpack, right? We internalize notions of gender based on socializing institutions, meaning conversations, schools, places, which helps us form our gender identities. We then attempt to construct that gendered identity through our interactions with others, which is gender expression, whereas sex is biological characteristics, external genitalia, internal sex organs, chromosomes, and hormones. Okay? There is a difference. A woman is a woman, a man is a man. Yes, I understand. Trust me all too well. We know these things. But communicating with someone in a manner that they are more receptive to is not a negative. It is a positive. When we try to communicate to everyone and boss them around in the same way, we are the problem. Okay? So let's not be a problem. Gender itself has been under review for ages. In the 1800s, think about the women's suffrage movement, because before that, you guys didn't have a right to vote, women. Now that wasn't fair. That was just arbitrary. Much of history is not fair and was quite arbitrary. Let's do a better job of constructing things moving from this moment forward. When we think about the United States, we're working through gender identity as well, right? Gender identity and how we communicate and what is what, and that's a hot button topic, right? But whatever your feelings are in this area, please try to make your communication inclusive and positive. If you don't take anything else from this class, talk to people in a manner you would like to be talked to. Be considerate. Be kind. Be gracious. Be forgiving. Be patient. Gender plays a large role in how we communicate, such as expressing our feelings and self-worth. Think about boys. We're taught to hold those feelings in. Young women, not so much. When we think about sexuality, it relates to culture and identity in important ways that extend beyond the whole idea of sexual orientation, because then we can get into that one where people are attracted to other people for various reasons, or even, whatever it might be. So remember, race is more than just the color of one's skin, right? And gender is more than one's biological and physiological manifestations of masculinity or femininity. And sexuality isn't just physical. It is social, in that we communicate with others about sexuality. My wife's whole job revolves around women's wellness. So think about that. There's a lot to unpack there. I get to hear some stories, of course, never HIPAA things, but just situations. I get to hear when she's had a good day or a bad day. When there was a stillborn in the office, right? That's a horrible day. Here parents are about to be bringing a child into this world and they're so happy and they go to such a low spot. You know, so for her, communication has got to be about more than just medical terms. It's got to be more than just menstruation, right? And pregnancy and STDs and those things. It has to be about relationship. And while those things are mentioned, like sexual assault or abuse or harassment, there's so much more at stake. People's mental well-being is at stake. So for her, communication has to be wrapped up around that whole premise of sexuality and women and their needs and how they construct meaning in life. We think about sexual orientation. There are a wide range of sexual orientations, including one that's very rarely talked about, asexual. I have a friend who is a musician. He has done very well for himself. He has tried to have relationships on both sides of the spectrum, by the way, both genders. It didn't make him bisexual. What it ended up making him was asexual, which was the thing he was all along. He just didn't care about sexuality at all. Sometimes he sings about parts of it in his songs, but the reality is he's an asexual being. That's not what drives him. What drives him is social injustice. What drives him is experience. What drives him is those who have and those who haven't. What drives him is making music that's about a moment. If you think about the idea of sexual orientation, again, it wasn't really categorized until the 1800s. We can thank Sigmund Freud and others for that whole idea set, right? You can check out Table 822. It talks about sexuality and sexual identity, how it was constructed over 3,000 years. But again, remember what I keep leaning into? Be kind one to another. Be respectful. Be courteous. Be accepting. You don't have to understand. Think about ability and disability. There's another area. I have friends who are deaf, have been deaf since birth. I played outfield next to an outfielder who was deaf. We communicated through hand signs and pointing. It's a pure and simple, and we were quite good. Quite good. He was my second favorite outfielder to play with, okay? I just was blessed to have a guy who was drafted and chose not to really go very far in baseball because he had other issues. He had issues with communicating, and basically what his diagnosis was Tourette's. And so I got to play with at one point I literally had a deaf outfielder on one side of me and a person who had Tourette's on the other side of me. And so communication wasn't always the easiest, right? But it wasn't hard for me because we learned ways to get around. When the person with Tourette's had a good game, I made sure my locker was next to his, and I made sure that I helped him if there were interviews. I hadn't gotten a degree in communication yet. I went straight out of to play baseball out of high school. But the point was, I knew that he had struggles and tics and things that we wanted to keep the answers short and sweet and get things moving so that he didn't have an episode in front of the camera, which would make his life much more difficult to manage, right? You know, same token of I ended up sometimes being involved in the interviews with the deaf outfielder too, because I knew sign language. I dated a deaf girl in high school, so I knew sign language, and so I would relay what he was saying to the cameras, to the people. It was a unique place for me to be, and I hadn't even decided to be in communication yet. I was just playing baseball. But not everybody has the same skill set, and not everybody has the same level of wellness as our bodies, right? People were afflicted with things. People struggle through things, whether it's high anxiety or the inability to hear or see, or being paralyzed from the waist down. Life's not fair. Life's full of moments where it's not fair. But yet we as a society, and we as a culture, and we as communicators can try to make it as fair as we can. Think about this. We can all join the disabled group at any point in time with a bad accident, with an unfortunate event happening to us, right? A friend of mine was practicing for his decathlon and just messing around off. He was an Olympian and decided to join in a pickup basketball game that was going on in his community, right? And he had an accident. And for a moment, he was completely paralyzed. And when I say for a moment, I'm talking about 2 weeks. First of all, he was in a coma for over a week. 2 weeks he was paralyzed completely, and then he started having some movement in his upper body. Eventually he was able to regain, I won't say full movement, but he was able to regain quite a bit of his movement. In one moment, he went from being a potential Olympian decathlon athlete, competing in all of those events, to being in a coma, being paralyzed, and learning to walk again. So if you don't think that disabilities is important, or being good with the ADA and trying to communicate with others is important, think again. Because any one of us can join the disabilities group without wanting to, needing to. It just happens. So try to be inclusive. Include them into your life. Ableism is a system of beliefs and practices that includes physical and mental standards that are projected as normal for human beings, and therefore there are deviations from it that are abnormal, right? That's what the medical community talks about even. It's up to us to create inclusion and help for others. I once attended a workshop about ability privilege led by a man who was visually impaired. He talked about how, unlike cultural identities that are typically stable over a lifetime, ability fluctuates for most people. We've all experienced times where we were more or less able. I'm dealing with aging. I used to be super fast. I could play center field. I'm not fast anymore, guys. I'm in my 50s now. I just got into my 50s. I'm not fast anymore. Now I'm limited to corner infield pretty much, and maybe right field, but right now my right arm is hurting because I have a bone spur and I need to get it taken care of. I thought it was a torn rotator cuff that was giving me trouble from way back when, in my 20s, but no, I actually have a bone spur. It's outpatient surgery. I'll get it done soon. But the point is, I'm changing as an individual. I have to move through being slightly less able. 20% of the U.S. population has some form of disability. And as we get older, we will join them. Okay? Think about it. So be courteous, be kind, be inclusive in our communication. Check out chart 8.4 for historical context, because we have not treated people with disability very well. I talk a little bit about eugenics. I don't want you to concentrate on that, other than understand that some people really like to criticize other people. We need to be inclusive. We need to take care of people. I need to move forward, though, because we've got so much to talk about. Being look at I included the 10 Commandments of etiquette for communicating with people with disabilities. Please look at that slide. It's after the people talking in sign language, right after that. So please look at it. I've got it as page 37. Intercultural communication. Think about how we communicate with other cultures, how important it is, and what we need to do to be effective. Instead of being self-focused, be other-focused. Learn. We can learn so much from other cultures. Goodness gracious, I got my phone blown up. Sorry about that. No idea. It's spam call at that too. Go figure. We need to think about how their cultures communicate. I talked a little bit about Eastern versus Western cultures earlier, the dialectics between those, how we talk a lot as Americans, whereas Eastern cultures tend to say more with silence and body positioning and things of that nature. I do talk about the 6 dialectics of intercultural communication. I'm not going to put that on the test. It might be on the final, maybe. I don't think so. Okay. It's important, but I've got so much to cover. Japan is a high context culture, which means they look for nonverbal cues like silence, tone, and for what's not being said as constructing their meaning. We're low context. We talk. We're going to use 50,000 words and we'll be loud and boisterous because that's what Americans are. But we can handle ourselves differently as situations change, as we come into contact with other people. We need to be other-oriented. It's not us and them. We're all human beings, and we're all in this together. I know that there's some businesses, even in the Stevens County area and the neighboring counties, that they work with people of other cultures because that's who owns the company. Whether it's European owned, whether it's owned by a Korean company. Point is, you have to learn how to speak with people in ways that make sense for them. A business meeting in America can be done in 20 minutes sometimes. A Chinese business meeting? Goodness gracious. I used to teach Chinese students, the kids that were really gifted, to bring them up to speed to go to top tier schools in the United States. When teaching those kids, it would take 2 or 3 lessons with them and their parents before their parents would actually really see how professional and what I brought to the table. They were not quick to judge. They really watched things. They looked at how I interacted with their children, and I looked at how I motivated their children. And I even talked to them about what their plans were for the future, even though they were younger. Versus, I've got American parents I tutor their kids and I can't even get them to respond to me and provide their child with internet access or, other needs that the child has. So, it's frustrating in moments. Culture can be frustrating, but we've got to be respectful. We have to understand how others want to communicate and work with them to find the middle to communicate in that middle section. And that's what I talk about. I also talk about intercultural communication and relationship, how that creates a new concept and struggles within it, right? We talked about relationships, and then, add in different cultures and how people perceive things. It can make a cultural relationship or friendship a bit more difficult if we don't take into account and effectively communicate in ways that make sense to both parties. Throughout the book, I've been talking about it's not a rule set. It's putting tools into your communication toolbox to improve our communication competency. Many of those tools can be translated into intercultural context. Being respectful, taking the time to be communicative, leaving our comfort zones, being willing to adapt to new and uncertain circumstances. Those are the hallmarks of creating ICC, or intercultural communication competency. We can do it. I could teach a whole class on this section of this chapter. So I'm again trying to move through it and get to where we need to be. But if you're curious about a culture, it's the perfect opportunity. My wife and I are thinking about going abroad soon. Stepdaughter will be done with school. My wife's father is coming to the end of life, and my parents are older, but I have two sisters that have been taking a leader role in that. We are considering moving abroad because I could get a job as a communication attaché, could still teach online, and still do the things I want to do. And my wife, with her medical degrees, can work in pretty much any country, right? That's why we're learning Spanish. We're thinking about moving elsewhere. Probably Ecuador, not sure. Point is, you have to be willing. The United States is a dominant group. We tend to be less motivated intrinsically and extrinsically towards intercultural communication with non-dominant groups because we don't see incentives for doing so. I do, but I'm just stating as a society, we've kind of failed at that. It's up to us to address that and look to the beauty, the values, the learning, and the ability for us to communicate with each other and get more out of each other, meaning be able to work together in a closer manner and do more for ourselves. Knowledge supplements motivation. Learn about a culture, then start to adapt, live in it, learn to communicate in it. As you recall from communication and perception, who we are through our interactions with others has to do with perception, right? How we see things. Then we change our communication, sometimes rightly or wrongly, and then listening is going to be crucial for ICC. So we've got to be patient, got to be kind, have to listen. Be mindful. Cognitive flexibility refers to the ability to continually supplement and revise existing knowledge to create new categories rather than forcing new knowledge into old categories. Meaning, we have to be accepting that the world doesn't work in the way we really would like it to sometimes, and we have to figure out how to be more effective. We can take new information and learn how to communicate better. That's what I'm asking you to do with cognitive flexibility. Have the motivation and knowledge, then you can be a better communicator. Most of this is not going to be on the test, so again, I'm just making sure I hit the high points. I want to thank you for being in class. We're wrapping it up now. Please, I don't know why it says Unit 4 there. That's really weird. Anyway, please complete the homework in Unit 8 after watching this video. Thank you so much for participating and being a part of this. I truly want to make you a better communicator. I don't want to force you to be. I want you to allow you to be and show you some tools to get there. But literally, cultural communication, I could teach a whole class on it. Have a great day. See you next time. Bye-bye.